and does fear keep you from sharing more of your authentic self with others? As humans, we constantly calculate the risks and rewards of revealing who we are to those around us. And often we prioritize short-term safety and comfort over long-term connection and fulfillment. This is especially true for members of marginalized groups whose calculations may look very different depending on the environment. This week, I talked with Travis Rivera, a Latinx, queer, disabled, gender non-conforming professional storyteller. Here, Mark shares his personal journey with storytelling and how it has allowed him to honor his life's calling. We also talk about the power of storytelling and vulnerability to foster greater inclusion and connection among us all. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Menninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Mark. As we were talking about before I hit record, it is so wonderful to officially meet you. We've been trading messages for a while now, and I'm so glad to have a chance to have this conversation with you. And I would love to start by inviting you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so Kim, it's great to formally meet you virtually. Yes, it's been months and months of communication, so it's nice to finally put a face to the email. My name is Travis Rivera. I use he, him pronouns. I am a Latinx, queer, disabled, gender non-conforming professional storyteller. And I am the founder of The Professional Storyteller, which is my brand moniker and business for using the power of story to create a more inclusive world. And so at my core, I tell stories. And how I tell those stories varies, but why I tell the stories doesn't. I tell the stories because I believe that stories connect us, which is why I like to be on podcasts like yours to share parts of my story and how I use that experience to help others navigate their own journey.
I love that so much. And I want to just start with a question of how did you get here? Like, what was your career path that led you to the storytelling and this venture that you have now?
You know, I started writing at a very young age, winning my first poetry contest in grammar school, tying first place for the fourth grade category of citywide poetry contest for the DARE program, which is like the anti-drugs, don't do drugs stuff. And I remember that feeling I felt when I was standing in front of a crowded room, reciting the poem I wrote that tied me for first place. And growing up as a disabled child, I was born premature. My mom gave birth to me at 5.5 months. I weighed 1 pound. And due to circumstances of my birth, I developed something called cerebral palsy. And it runs on a spectrum of severity. For me, it was a lot more severe growing up, affecting me mostly from the hips down. And so through orthopedic surgery, braces, orthopedic shoes, physical therapy for over a decade, and eventually discovering dance later in high school, writing and storytelling through my journal was how I dealt with the isolation of being othered. Because in certain gym activities I couldn't do, so I would be forced to sit out because it was a liability to have a disabled child, doing something in gym that they physically could not manage to do by themselves. And this is back in the mid to late 90s. And so I remember feeling really isolated and othered. And I found refuge in my marbled composition notebook. And I just started writing journals, entries, and song lyrics and poetry. And it kind of just spiraled from there. And I always knew I wanted to be a storyteller. Like there are some people who's like, oh, I didn't know I want to do that. Or, I didn't know how my life would turn out, because that's kind of, to be a writer is to to be okay with the ambiguity of what that career might look like. But it took me a long time to call myself a professional writer or storyteller. And so the irony is that 11 years after I started my speaking career, 14 years since I started my dance career and professional writing career, I now wholeheartedly embrace the fact that I am a professional storyteller. So much so that I called my business the professional storyteller. And on the onset, that might be like, oh, that's pretty pretentious or pompous. But for me, it was about claiming who I know I've always been and not allowing imposter syndrome or the naysayers detract from who I am. At my core, I am a storyteller. And I believe that telling stories connects us. And I believe in the power of stories to create a more inclusive world.
One question I have that comes up immediately as you think about going from being that child who feels isolated, feels alone, and is writing in your journal to then sharing your stories publicly, right? Because that is such an expression of your innermost feelings and thoughts. How did that feel for you to go from having this be your private journal to putting them out into the world? Because I love the way you recognize the connectivity that comes from that, but it's got to be scary too.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of vulnerability. My first collection of poetry and essays called Drafts, an Imperfect Collection of Writing, available on Amazon, and soon will be available for direct purchase for a signature from my website, was a compilation of stories I wrote in high school mostly, so 14 through 27. So between high school, college, and a few years after college and starting my professional career in higher ed, I put this compilation together. And this little book that would open up doors for me. And what always surprises me, I always tell this story of a colleague who is a former colleague who's a dear friend, her father being in town from Jamaica, who's in his late 70s, visiting her, and he sees my book on her bookshelf. And the cover entices him, so he picks it up. And so my immediate reaction when she told me that her father picked up my book was, oh my gosh, this Caribbean man in his 70s is about to read this book about a queer young Caribbean boy who's Puerto Rican, who's talking about mental health and sex and queerness and suicide and all these other things. And he read it in a matter of days. And he told her, "You have to read this book. I cannot believe you have not yet fully read this book." He was captivated by it, and it's one of the best examples I have of how stories can connect us, and how on the surface he and I cannot be more different, right? He is heterosexual. I am queer. He is in his 70s. I'm in my 30s. We're both Caribbean men. He's Jamaican descent. I'm Puerto Rican descent. Um, and despite that, right, despite the obvious differences between us, there are parts of my story that deeply resonate with him and allowed him to see the world through a different gaze, through a different lived experience. And I think, that is the power of storytelling. And what I remind myself is whenever I get too scared to tell certain parts of my story, I do what I call strategic filters, which is, have I processed the story properly with my therapist and my coach? Have I healed from this particular experience? Am I ready for it to be known to the world? Have I beta tested it with a smaller group of people who I trust? Right. And so those are some of the things that I do before deciding what gets published, what gets told on a podcast, what gets shared in a book or journal, what kind of work or talkbacks I do and things I share in my speaking engagements. And so that's kind of how I do that strategic filter around navigating who owns the right to hear that story, what parts of the story can they hear, what parts can they not hear. And it's not that I'm being inauthentic, it's that I am recognizing that first and foremost, my story is mine, right? And no one else gets to decide how and when I share parts of my story. But I also have to recognize that if I'm just sharing for the sake of oversharing, that puts me in a very difficult place in my mental health journey. And also, it means that because there are things out there that I've said that I regret saying, things that I wish I hadn't said, right? And so now I know that when I speak from a space of, am I ready to share this? What parts am I ready to share? How am I ready to share it? When will I share it? And those are the ways in which I decide what parts of my story I use to frame or to serve as a vehicle for the work that I'm trying to teach someone, whether it's about mental health, whether it's about queerness, whether it's about disability in the arts, whether it's about intersectionality or holistic inclusion in the workplace. My story, because I'm not a motivational speaker, I think people feel motivated and empowered when they hear me speak, which is a byproduct. But I am at my core someone who educates, someone who believes in theories and frameworks to make the world better. And so, no shade to those who are motivational speakers who just simply share their life story. I simply use parts of my story as a vehicle to frame the larger point I'm trying to make.
Mm. And what this is making me think is that you're describing strategic vulnerability, right? And it sounds funny to say it that way, but, and don't let me put words in your mouth, but what I'm thinking about is that if you go through the vetting process that you've described, it must be easier to handle any potential criticism or backlash, right? Because I'm just thinking about this in the context of everyday workplaces too. One of the things that I often say is like, know your core values and what you stand for, so that when you are faced with the choice of, do I speak, do I share, do I challenge, or do I stay quiet on the sidelines, that you can ask yourself which of these actions is in greatest alignment with who I want to be and what I stand for. And once you know that, you can handle any objections or, any kind of negative feedback that might come from that more easily. It's not something we all ever want, right? We all want people to love us and our ideas, but it's just making me think that once you've gone through that process of really recognizing, yes, I'm ready to share, and I've gone through these filters, that you're probably in a much more empowered place at that point.
Absolutely. And furthermore, the goal for me isn't to be perfect, and the goal isn't to be liked by everyone. The goal is to be authentic. And I believe that authenticity is a daily choice. Every day I choose to be myself. Whether I'm depressed that day, whether I'm low energy, whether I'm super energized and super productive, whether I'm crushing my goals for the quarter, whether I'm getting my to-do lists done in a timely manner, whether I'm being intentional about carving out personal time and wellness time and friends and family time. I value that as an entrepreneur, as a creative entrepreneur, I have control over my schedule. And entrepreneurship might be the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. It would probably be the hardest thing I ever do in my life, except becoming a parent. If I ever decided to become a dad, I think that would be probably the most difficult thing, to be a parent. But besides that, yeah, it is a point of empowerment. And you know what? I can't control what the critic says, especially as a choreographer and a writer. Like, I'm putting out art in the world, and art is always subjective, right? And so someone may say that dance piece was terrible, or someone may say that essay was trash. It was like an eighth grader wrote it. That's an actual comment that someone wrote in one of my articles. So trust me, I don't read the comments anymore. But also, what I tell myself is, did I stay true to the story I was trying to tell? Am I honoring the calling of my life? Because if I'm honoring the calling of my life, it becomes less and less important what other people think, how they perceive me, or how they receive my art. Now, we all want to be liked. We all want to be appreciated and have our art mean something. And trust me, my art resonates with people, but it doesn't resonate with everyone. And I said this one saying once, tongue in cheekly. I said, if I'm not your cup of tea, don't take a sip. Because you won't be everyone's cup of tea. Not everyone's gonna like you, not everyone's gonna understand you. But also, we're more than the work that we produce. We're more than the things we create. And what I often struggle with as a young person, especially because I was really young when I started my career, is that people just want to see me professionally, and they forget that there's a whole person beyond the work, or behind the scenes doing the work. That person is messy, and that person is imperfect, and that person is a queer young 32-year-old navigating life in the South as a brown person who is gender non-conforming and disabled and all the things. And there is no blueprint for me. I'm the first one in my family to graduate high school, first one to graduate college, first one to be a creative entrepreneur. There is no safety net and poles that hold that net together. I am the net and the pole for myself. And so I have to remind myself that when imposter syndrome and shame really revs up on my head, I have to remind myself that I've gotten myself this far. That from the moment I was born, I had to fight to survive. They often say that premature babies are the most resilient type of people because of the circumstances they had to endure in order to survive, to breathe, to live, to thrive. And, I think about that term failure to thrive. And I often think that's also what they often say about premature babies, the failure to thrive. And what I realized is that I didn't fail to thrive. I had to go from being a victim of my circumstances and being a survivor of my circumstances to being someone who thrived despite my circumstances. I think that's been the key difference for me is that I am proud of where I come from. I'm proud of the lineage I come from. And despite the hardships, I would never go back and wish I wasn't disabled. I would never go back and wish I wasn't Latino or wish I wasn't queer or gender non-conforming. And while those things are not always easy to embrace, right? It's not easy to love all of who you are all the time, right? Sometimes my weight fluctuates, sometimes I have acne, sometimes, my nails are perfectly shaped, sometimes they're not, right? And so it's like, how do we learn to embrace all of ourselves so we don't have untold stories within us?
Mm, yeah. And I wonder too, and this is probably a lot deeper than imposter syndrome even, but I feel like there's so much pressure just because of the way that we're sort of evolutionarily wired and we're so afraid of being rejected or not feeling a sense of belonging. We're so afraid to be true to our authentic selves because of the fear of rejection, right? And so that pushes us towards conformity in a way
Yeah.
that keeps us safe in some sense, but it also keeps us from being who we truly are. And I wonder, as you have navigated your life with the various identities that you've shared, have there been times when you have felt like you had to hide who you were to fit in? And like, do you have advice for people right now who are in workplaces that are holding back, that aren't sharing who they are because of that fear?
Yeah, no, that's real. I remember being a teenager working. One of the last jobs I had before I started my dance company at 17 was working as a summer counselor for my church, the church I used to go to. And I had came out to them and they were like, oh, we can't have a queer counselor at a Christian camp for children. We have to fire you. And I remember feeling so ashamed because I had grown up in the church. Actually, one of the career paths I thought I was going to take was become a youth pastor. And obviously I ended up doing that. But, I think it's really interesting, because my faith is a big part of who I am, but I spent most of my 20s running from it. And now in my 30s, I'm reconnected in a more intentional way with my faith because I recognize that there's no separating the spiritual, faithful, queer, Latino, disabled man that I am from each other. And that I am all those things in totality. And, there's a couple things I always think about, right? When I decide, do I wear a dress to this event? Do I wear sneakers? Do I wear heels? It's safety, right? We all need to be psychologically and physically safe. We are living at a time in our country, especially, but even around the world, where being queer or trans is can be a death penalty or can lead to serious harm. And so there's real life implications. But also in the workplace where you should assume that you have some kind of safety, physical safety, you find the people you can trust. Sometimes being fully authentic doesn't mean you tell all of yourself to everyone, but it means you have that one coworker that you really trust. I have a coworker who, before she got married to her wife and, came out as a queer woman, she would have a lot of conversations with me about how her seeing me in the workplace gave her the courage to come out, gave her permission to be more herself. And I always say that authenticity has a ripple effect. When we see someone being all themselves wholeheartedly, it empowers us to be the same way. And next thing you know, everyone's just showing up as them full selves. And, like showing up as your full selves also means like I'm having this conversation with you today about being confident in who I am and being proud of who I am. While just last night, I was like in my head overthinking this prospect of this guy that I like that is super handsome and super smart and super accomplished in his career, and me thinking, I'm not enough.
Mm.
I'm not good enough for him. I'm too feminine for him. I'm too XYZ, right? And we had just had a lovely evening together with a group of our friends. And it was amazing. And so I had no reason to be so in my head. but I'm human. And I think that, what we cannot forget is that no matter what we do for a living or the impact we have or the calling of our lives, we will never not feel insecure. We will never not feel like an imposter. But it's not our fault, right? We live in a world that is simply bombarding us with messages telling us why we're never enough. You're not skinny enough, you're not smart enough, you're not talented enough, you're not making enough money, you're not educated enough, you're not, you know, um, cool enough, you're not XYZ enough, right? And so when you're constantly being bombarded with messages, I am not enough, it is hard to look at yourself in the mirror or sit across from someone in a workplace or other place setting and feel like you belong there.
Mm. Yeah. And as you say that about being bombarded with all of those messages, it occurs to me too to think about what did they gain from making you feel that way?
Oh, if we're gonna go there, can we go there, Kim? I think that white supremacy from its inception has required us to police each other, to dehumanize one another, so we can maintain this white heteropatriarchal structure, right? And so I often joke with my friends, give me the confidence of a mediocre white man.
That's right.
But there is nothing that a mediocre white man won't try to do.
Mm.
He will inflate his assets. He will say how wealthy he is. He will say that he's educated, that he's healthy, that he's 6'4", right? He will say all those things because he's a mediocre white man who has been told that regardless of his deficits, he was enough.
Mm.
But at the top of the chain, that he was worthy of the highest office simply because he was a white man who wanted it.
Yeah, you're right.
Right. And so when you have women, people of color, disabled folks, LGBT folks, and those who exist at the intersections of those identities, it is like hard to imagine that we would have the audacity to even try to be or live or engage or lead or work the way a mediocre white man does.
Mm. Yeah, you're so right. And maybe this is a good time to bring in what you and I started to talk about too before hitting record, and that's the power of community, because I think that there's so much focus on the inner work that we can all do. And I think there's a lot of benefit to doing that. But I also think that, and you've touched on this through some of the stories that you've shared, just really finding people that you can
Yeah.
trust is so important.
Absolutely. So every year, Kim, to lead to the point I was telling you before the interview, is every year I pick a word. And so last fall, before getting laid off, before I knew I was to get laid off, I was asking the universe, God, to like, what is going to be the word for 2023? And I was leaving my doctor's office, going into the Uber to head home. And then I was talking to the Uber driver, which I often do when I have good energy for the driver. We were having a conversation about our lives, and she was like, I'm going through a divorce. My children are already grown. I'm entering this later phase of my life. And for the first time, all I have to worry about is me. And she was like, I don't know what to do. And I thought to myself, oh my God, that's the word, me. What would be 2020? What would 2020 be like if I truly believed in myself, if I knew that I was worthy of building the life I wanted to live so I can maximize my potential and actually honor the calling of my life without fragmenting myself. And then shortly after, I found out I got laid off. And then I was like, oh, yep, it's the year of me time. I'm going to launch my business, professional storyteller. I'm going to be a full-time creative entrepreneur. And I'm going to struggle to build my business because I don't want to be my later half of my life and wondering what could have been, what should have been, right? I don't want to get to the end of my life and regret never truly living it.
Mm-hmm.
I won't live perfectly, right? And also, part of the year of me is recognizing that there is no me without the we. My former roommate in California, who's a dear friend of mine, Shai, who is from India. She was a boarding school kid. She's lived in Dubai. She lived all over the world. She went to college in the States. And she said to me, Mark, most people are lucky to have 1 to 2 good friends that are really there for them. She was like, you have a whole damn wall full. of people. And to clear the audience, 'cause I know you can't see it, I have a people I admire, hashtag people I admire wall, where I have selfies and pictures of people throughout my life, family, friends, colleagues, teachers, mentors, some well-known folks like Oprah and I, and me and Brene Brown, and news journalist Joanne Reed of the Readout at MSNBC. And so, I look at that wall every single day when I wake up, and I am reminded that I am loved, that I have some of the best people in my life, that when I am at my lowest, when I feel the most insecure, when I feel like I'm the biggest imposter, I look at that wall in the morning and I'm reminded that I am surrounded by a community, that when I can't love myself, I will always have communal love. And I think that we've become so individualistic in our healing journeys, especially people of color, that we forget that culturally, we always believed in a village. We always believed that it took a village to raise a child. And somewhere along the way, where there's individualism, capitalism, the results of white supremacy culture, we forgot that we're not meant to live this life alone. There's a reason why from the moment we are conceived, we are connected to another human being by the umbilical cord. That our very development and existence depends on that umbilical cord connection. So why do we, as a community, as a society, believe that the moment a person is brought into this world, that they suddenly have to be left alone? Which is why we're having an epidemic of loneliness in this country, which is why mental health is becoming such a major issue, which is why the pandemic simply revealed what so many people were afraid to say out loud. Because suddenly so many more people were experiencing it, right? The truth is we are a human species. We need human connection. We all want to feel a sense of love and belonging. We all want to be seen and heard for exactly who we are and be accepted for it. Now, I don't want to be tolerated. I don't tolerate the mediocre white man. I accept his mediocrity, and I accept that he is privileged and that he has had an easier life because of that white privilege and because of that male privilege. I accept that's the reality, right? I don't want to be tolerated as a brown person who's queer and disabled. I want to be accepted. I want my work to speak for itself. And I want people to recognize that they don't have to do it all alone because we were never meant to. And so who you surround yourself with, the people you surround yourself with, become voices when the inner critic, when the inner voice is too mean, too dehumanizing, and too critical of oneself.
Mm. Well, you said so many important things there. And I think what I'm thinking about first is the tendency, it's almost like a self-perpetuating cycle, right? If you focus so much on yourself, and perhaps because you're afraid to be vulnerable, and there may well be legitimate reasons for that in certain contexts, as you talked about safety. But if we close ourselves in and shut ourselves off from the people around us, we perpetuate the systemic effects of the loneliness, of us not feeling that sense of community. And so it feels like the fix, so to speak, is to do the really uncomfortable thing, which is in those moments when we would rather not be seen because we're feeling doubtful about ourselves, or shame or something, to actually take that step and reach out to somebody else to connect.
Yeah, I'm often the friend that reaches out to check in on people. I am not often the friend that is checked on. But it's because my friends know that if I'm going through something, I have the skills and the coping mechanisms to reach out for help. A lot of my friends don't have that.
Yeah.
Right? This is what, year 13 of therapy for me? I don't know. Therapy's kicking my ass lately. So I've been doing the hard work, but around emotional regulation and interpersonal communication and all that. I really want to just stress, it's not easy. And there are days that are easier than others. There are days when I can't get out of bed. There are days when I'm excited to go out into the world and be on those stages and be premiering new works and, reading and writing that article and doing these podcast interviews. And there are days when I'm just like, can I disappear? Can I stay in bed and pretend that the blankets are an armor? But when we disconnect ourselves from the difficulties of being human, aka the suffering that comes with being human, we also disconnect ourselves from the experiences of joy of love, of laughter, of gratitude. And so there is no, Brene Brown says there is no numbing the bad stuff without numbing the good stuff, the good emotions, right? And so, Brene Brown, I have to give her a lot of credit because her work in 2013, I first discovered her in 2013, the Oprah Super Soul Sunday, and I'm showing the audience that they can't see it, but there's a tattoo of my arm that says "Daring Greatly" in the typewriter font, which is I'm notorious for having typewriter font tattoos. And Daring Greatly was the first Brene Brown book I read. How the courage to be vulnerable changes the way we live, lead, and love, or parent, or something like that. And it changed my life. And the fact that I got to meet her twice, the fact that she has a copy of my book in her office
Wow.
baffled me because I gave her a signed copy after I saw her at one of the other events. And it's such a reminder for me that we all have stories that we want to tell. We all have dreams and desires. And some of us are very privileged that we get to live out those dreams and desires. Some of us don't have the luxury that some of us have. And not because some of us worked harder than others. Some of it's just circumstantial, right? I think about my brother who was murdered at 22, you know, so when I turned 23, I officially outlived my brother. And next year I'm turning 33, which will be 11 years older than he would have been, like since he was murdered. And I think to myself, what were the chances that he happened to be caught up in the hood lifestyle, or what we call the hood, right? Our urban inner city lifestyle. And not even lifestyle, right? Like he did what he had to do to survive, to provide for his family. Because we live in a world where an Afro Latino without a college degree wasn't given many chances at the time, right? And then you have someone like me, the one who chose to go the academic and creative route, the one who chose not to hang out in the street, the one who chose to figure out things differently, to go on and have this career that many people didn't think was possible. I'm not, I give Jennifer Lopez credit for this. I am not the most talented choreographer, speaker, writer, right? Or dancer. But what I am is very dedicated to my craft and I work really freaking hard.
Mm.
And so what I lack in talent, I make up for in craftsmanship. There are many talented people who don't have successful careers
That's true. Yeah.
because talent is not enough, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like if I pull this all together with the themes that you've been sharing, it's not letting your inner critic or imposter syndrome or self-doubt, whatever it is, dictate your life, how far you go, surrounding yourself with the people who will lift you up, will support you in those moments, and just really being passionate about living the life that you are meant to live. And I think so often we make choices based on short-term gain, not on long-term gain. And the short-term gain is immediate, a feeling of safety. It's easier not to share than it is to share. It's easier not to rock the boat than it is to speak. But then to your point, at the end of our lives, when we look back, is that the life we will have been proud to have lived? And so everything you say is so true, that being human is really hard for
Oh
so
yes.
right, for so many different reasons. Everyone has their
There's not one person in my life who has not had some kind of suffering or struggle that is either continuous, pervasive, or quite frequent, right? And the difference between those who go from being a victim, survivor to thriver are those who are unwilling to stop living simply because being human is so difficult. They take advantage of their privilege of access to mental health care, to their good support systems, their spiritual faith, right? They do exercise and yoga, they do different things, they work on their diet, they do all these other things to cope with being human because being human is really freaking hard, especially when we're bombarded again with messages that says you are not enough, right? And it's that script, you are not enough, that feeds the imposter syndrome. And while oftentimes, to your point earlier, imposter syndrome is seen as a very individualistic thing, it is not. I and you do not choose to choose that we are imposters. We don't choose to doubt our abilities or skill sets or ability to do things. But we live in a society that says we are not enough. And so imposter syndrome isn't an individualistic thing. It's a societal problem that we do not talk enough about as a collective. So often it says, you have imposter syndrome, you have to overcome it. This is how you overcome it. Well, why is it on me to overcome something when I'm not the one who's creating those barriers in the first place? When I'm not the one writing the script that says I am not enough simply because I'm queer or disabled or gender non-conforming or Latino, right? Or whatever the case may be, right? And so what we need to recognize, and I think what we need to do to deepen the conversation around imposter syndrome is to recognize how are we dealing with the societal conditions that allow imposter syndrome to be running rampant, especially because it often only impacts the most marginalized people.
Yes.
It never seems to impact the mediocre white man.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. And that is why the power of community and the collective is so important, because if we all buy into the narrative that we are individually not good enough, we stop trying.
Yeah.
We stop putting ourselves out there. But
And which is why, my tagline for my company is my story, your story, our story. Right? Because by hearing my story, that you start to share your story. Then when you share your story, it becomes then we start to tell our stories, right? Then so it becomes me to you to our. All of us telling our stories makes people realize they're not alone. Or they're not wild for like having these feelings, even though they're successful or have done certain things in their careers, right? And that imposter syndrome isn't their fault.
yes.
It is a societal condition that we have to decondition ourselves from being a part of.
Yeah, you're absolutely
So
right.
we're not responsible for the condition that we're surrounded with. We are responsible for the way we heal from it.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that was so beautifully said. I'm so grateful to you for this
Thank
conversation.
you.
I feel like, I'm just so inspired. I could keep going and going. And but I definitely want to ask you how others who are feeling similarly and want to stay connected to you can do so. What's the best place for people to find you?
So LinkedIn is where it's on and popping for professional folks. And then if you want some more of my personal / professional life, Instagram. But we're going to include my Linktree link on the show notes. And so that has ways you can sign up for my bi-weekly newsletter. You can schedule an engagement chat with me if you want to book me for a coaching session or speaking engagement. You can connect with me on social media, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn. And there's other things you can see, like my TEDx talk. You can have links to other interviews I've done with some of my dance work. So yeah, that's a great way to stay connected with me. And if you are someone who is listening to this podcast and you reach out to me on LinkedIn, feel free to send me a message. You can email me when you click on the link tree as well. I would love to hear how this message or my conversation with Kim resonate with the audience. It's always great to hear how this work impacts people. And I want to thank you, Kim. It's always kind of weird reaching out to folks like, hey, I think I would be great for your podcast. And sometimes people have told me, no, you're not, or they begrudgingly let me on. And I was just like, oh, okay. And but like you were like, yes, of course, I would love to have you on my podcast. And it was great to kind of feel like, because it is hard, it is vulnerable to like put yourself out there and recognize that yes, this work is meaningful, but it also requires you to be vulnerable and reach out to people and say, hey, I think my story might be great for your podcast audience. And sometimes the podcast host will say, I disagree. Or they'll say, oh, absolutely, let's have you on. Right. And so I always remind myself that it's a great privilege to be able to live the life that I live. My mother still doesn't understand what my career is. She's like, they do what? Traveling there again? Why are you traveling so much? Why are they paying you? How is this your full-time job? What? And my mother's the unpublished storyteller of my life. I got my writing talent and my storytelling talent from her. But she never had the opportunities that I had.
Yeah.
Trauma made her defer her dreams. And the suffering of that deferment made her dreams denied. And so I recognize that every single day I get up to my own home, my own space, a roof over my head, a quiet space, a cozy space, a safe space, a brave space. And I get to live out my calling each and every day. On days when getting up is too hard, simply getting up is enough.
That's so well said. Thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you're doing. It's so important. I'm so grateful.
Yeah, thank you, Kim.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.